So today I'm going to talk about the PBS um, show about Mr. Rogers. It's Do I Like?
Oh, it's
And
got John Lithgow in there.
yeah, had a whole bunch of people. And this was put out in 2018. Wynton Marsalis, playing trumpet in 1986. He got his first trumpet when he was 6 years old. He said, "It's a matter of practicing every day." Mr. Rogers said that's a real way to talk with each other, playing music. And Sarah Silverman spoke about a musical session that Mr. Rogers and other musicians had together in 1986 when they played instruments that looked like toy instruments together. Mr. Rogers played a tiny piano. It was really small. And Bob Rasthorn played some made-up instrument with bells and stuff on it with a bow. And another friend played the guitar. Sarah said, "He doesn't care how he looks, and that's why he always looks awesome. Because he's willing to be vulnerable. He's willing to be open and learn stuff." It was inspiring. And I agree with her completely. 1985, Mr. Rogers said, "Some people play an instrument and other people don't. It's so important to find out what we feel good about doing and then practice that." Michael Keaton mentioned Mr. Rogers' degree in music composition, how he wrote complex music and lyrics and introduced children to different music by bringing a variety of guests into the neighborhood. Yo-Yo Ma with his cello, his son Nicholas playing on the piano. Nicholas said that he only performed with his father on Mr. Rogers. They played beautifully together. We played twice, once when Nicholas was little and then when he was 16 years old. 1975, Fabulous Flying Zucchini Brothers and the Land of Make-Believe. Mr. Rogers used the Land of Make-Believe to explore life's issues, said Michael Keaton. 1981, Big Bird, Carol Spinney, was a guest in the Land of Make-Believe. He wouldn't take off his costume to show people that that there was a person inside, so Mr. Rogers had to keep him in the Land of Make-Believe.
So Big Bird was a woman?
No,
Okay.
just a man named Carol.
Okay, then.
So,
just want to make sure.
Yeah. When you see witches on television, this is a quote, "It's always pretend. When you are growing up, it's an important thing to be able to tell the difference between what's pretend and what's real," says Mr. Rogers. Sarah Silverman loved Mr. Rogers because he never lied to kids. He always told us the truth, she said. Michael Keaton said, "Life can get serious, even when you're under 5, and Mr. Rogers knew that. It helped to talk about it. He called it important talk. And right here on public television, he was willing to talk to children about such things as death, divorce, and birth. He actually showed a kitten, Jimmy. So Jimmy had a personality. He even gave him a name, right? He was showing Jimmy the kitten when he was big enough to be playing and wandering around. And then he showed on the TV, he showed when Jimmy was born. And he talked about how he looked wet at first, like the kitten actually coming out of the mother cat was right there on the TV. And he said that the mother would dry him off and then he'd find her nipple to nurse on. When he started singing, "Did You Know It's All Right to Wonder?" Sarah Silverman was flooded with emotion. She said, "I'm gonna cry." And I could see her trying to hold back. She wasn't just making it up. Chris Kratt says, he's even speaking to adults there. "The first thing I learned from Mr. Rogers is that if I was brave enough that I could talk about it, it was going to be okay." Mr. Rogers, just a minute. Oh, he says, "Do you have ways of showing you're angry? Ways that don't hurt you or anybody else?" And then he sings, "What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite." Mr. Rogers shows us how Coco says "I love you" in sign language. And then he says, "She really has feelings for people and things," he says. As a boy plays the piano for Mr. Rogers, he doesn't watch his fingers, he watches his face, notices Joyce DiDonato. He's reading what's going on inside Nick's head, she says. She noticed that he was concerned only with the experience the child was having, not the outcome. Hilary Hand played the violin for Mr. Rogers in front of a sign that says, music lessons. And Mr. Rogers shows himself trying to learn to play the trombone and not succeeding right away. He says, you can't learn without making mistakes. Oh, that's Michael Keaton. You can't learn without making mistakes. I like to learn things, don't you? And there's so much in this world we can learn, no matter how young or how old we are, says Mr. Rogers. 1969, Officer Clemens was not a real officer, but played one on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. 24 years later, Officer Clemens was on the show again, and they again cooled their feet together in the kiddie pool. When they were finished, Mr. Rogers helped dry the officer's feet off. Francois Clemens played the recurring role for decades. Francois was a trained classical singer. Every person in the whole world is different from everybody else, he says, but the world is different, but we can still love each other because the most important thing about us are inside of us. So even if we look different or smell different or sound different on the outside, we're all human beings and have our thoughts and feelings inside. It's what's inside of us that matters most. Friendship and love don't cost any money at all, and they're very important. They introduced Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, a cartoon that uses the principles and songs from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Silverman says that Mr. Rogers continues to make me want to be the best person I can be. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the things that hide you. They're just beside you. He ends the show by singing, "It's a good feeling to know I'll be back when the day is new." So kids are left feeling comforted that he isn't abandoning them. Then PBS Kids promotes Daniel Tiger again, encouraging people to buy their DVDs, and then encourages the viewer to please give to your PBS station. So honestly, they did a great job, and at the end, they ruined it. They ruined it. Don't show me Daniel Tiger, because yeah, maybe that's going to be a popular cartoon show, but this is supposed to be about Mr. Rogers, right? So they ruined it, and I think anybody who loves Mr. Rogers is pissed off by seeing that ending. I'm really disappointed in PBS, and if you've watched me, you know I support what they do. I like their videos. The ending of this was crap. But anyway, I wanted to talk about how he ended the show and how important that is to a kid. I remember, like, my dad, he watched Mr. Rogers, and when I was having difficult times as a teenager, he'd watch Mr. Rogers, and I didn't understand it then. I thought he was having some second childhood or something like that. But he was trying to teach me what he'd learned. When he was a little boy, he was very sensitive. And my aunt had a son that was a lot like my dad, very sensitive. And my dad would tell me that when he'd watched the Friendly Giant at the end, he'd be crying. Were you the same?
Not quite that level, but I kind of get that way now if I hear that music.
Yeah, and so Mr. Rogers had noticed things like that, right? He had noticed this is not a good way for kids to leave the show in the morning. So, even though I love the Friendly Giant, I felt bad when it ended too. You know, not like my dad, not to that point, because I wasn't as sensitive as him. But kids feel things strongly. And so the way Mr. Rogers, he really paid attention to the kids and he tried to make things better for them. So it's just beautiful, really, to think about him. I think he's probably the most wonderful most positive influence for children in a very, very long time. And it's important to recognize that, like, there's a lot of people that... I'm going to talk about something else, and this is going to be uncomfortable for some people, but it's because Sarah Silverman was on there, and I really respected her a lot after seeing her. Like, I don't actually care for her as a comedian, but as a person, she is willing to talk about some important things, and with her work. So there was this one show. This is when I noticed that, wow, yeah, she's important. She was in a movie, and she was playing a woman who was the other woman. She was the woman who a married man was cheating with, and she was they had a sex scene, and she was making faces like she was in pain or uncomfortable, certainly. And then after they were done, he told her that he loved her, and she said, "Don't tell me you love me when we're having anal sex." You know, and so it was very clear, right? And people need to talk about this sort of thing, because nobody is. And kids are growing up trouble. Now, James and I have talked about this. In the 70s, there were a lot of women leaving men, divorcing, and probably for good reason, you know. There are a lot of crummy men out there. Not all men are crummy. Mr. Rogers, I can't even think of a female influence for children who's better than Mr. Rogers. Not all men are bad. And men are certainly needed. I think it's positive to have, I'm not saying that two women can't raise a child well, but I am saying that there needs to be a positive male influence and a positive female influence for every child growing up. So, and it's important for children to see that parents love each other. They need to be able to see what a healthy relationship looks like, or they don't grow up having one. So, yeah, I was just going to talk about that. But yeah, definitely watch the show. They did a great job. Maybe just once you see the Daniel Tiger cartoon, just stop it, because they ruined it. But it is a beautiful show up until that point. So, and Mr. Rogers is, I can't get enough of watching him. He's wonderful. So, anyway, I accidentally left my pinatas out in the rain again. So this one's even more bumpy, and that one's bumpy too. So my watermelons are going to be a little bit on the bumpy side. Oh well, not every watermelon's perfect. And try again. I can blow up another one, and maybe this time I'll remember not to leave it in the rain to get all bumpy.